The bridge went out from under her wagon with a sound like a rifle shot, and Winifred Underwood had just enough time to grab the leather satchel at her feet before the whole world tipped sideways. She heard the horse scream. She heard the timbers crack and give way in a long, splintering groan, and then the front of the wagon dropped and she was falling, actually falling, toward the gray rush of Silver Creek 40 feet below, swollen with the season's first hard rain and studded with granite the size of church bells. A hand closed around her wrist so hard it felt like a manacle. She hit something solid, not water, not rock, but a chest, an arm, a body that had thrown itself flat across the last standing timber of the bridge and caught her mid-fall the way a man catches a dropped rifle, without thinking, purely on reflex trained into muscle long before thought could interfere. For one long moment she hung there over the ravine, her boots swinging over nothing, her satchel crushed between her body and his, and she looked up into a face she did not recognize, all sharp angles and soot-streaked jaw, eyes the color of creek ice. "Hold still," the man said, in a voice that did not shake at all, though his arm was trembling with the effort of keeping them both from going over. "I've got you. Don't fight me." She did not fight him. She had grown up around men who gave orders meant to control her and men who gave orders meant to save her life, and she had learned early which was which. This was the second kind. She went still as a hung deer and let him haul her up and back, inch by inch, until her knees found the last solid plank and she was kneeling on it, gasping, her satchel still clutched against her ribs like a shield. Below them, what remained of her wagon crashed the rest of the way into the creek bed in a spray of splintered wood and a horse's terrified whinny. The horse had wrenched free of its traces somewhere in the fall and now thrashed in the shallows, unhurt but frantic, and the man who had just saved her life was already moving past her, sliding down the bank with the same economy of motion, wading into the cold water to catch the animal's halter and speak to it low, and even until it stopped fighting him. Winifred sat on the broken bridge, rain starting to needle down out of a sky the color of an old bruise, and watched a stranger gentle a terrified horse with nothing but his voice and his hands, and thought, with the strange clear detachment that sometimes comes after a brush with death, that she had never seen anyone so entirely unafraid. By the time he led the horse up the bank, she had gathered enough of herself to stand. "You're bleeding," he said, nodding at her temple, where she now realized a warm trickle was sliding toward her jaw. "I noticed the fall before I noticed that," she said. "I'm Winifred Underwood." Something flickered across his face, recognition, maybe, or wariness. Ruby Gulch was not so large a town that a woman who spoke Ute fluently and worked for the county Indian agent went unremarked. "I know who you are," he said. "Everybody in this gulch knows who you are, Miss Underwood. You're the one who talks to the Utes. And you're the one who just caught me falling off a bridge," she said. "I don't believe I know your name." "Orville Weston." He said it the way a man says a fact he expects to cause trouble. "I've got the smithy up the road and the ranch behind it." She had heard that name too, though not from anyone who had said it kindly. Weston. The blacksmith who'd killed a man 3 summers back and never once explained himself to anyone's satisfaction. The rancher folks crossed the street to avoid, whose forge fire burned at all hours like something restless. She looked at him now soaked to the thigh, breathing hard, holding her horse's halter with a gentleness she had not expected of a man with that reputation, and decided, the way she decided most things, that she would judge him by what she had just watched him do, and not by what she had heard. "Well, Mr. Weston," she said, "I owe you my life and my horse besides, and I've lost a wagon load of county papers into that creek, which is going to be a considerable headache. I don't suppose you have a way to get us both up to town before the light goes." He looked at her for a long moment, rain running off the brim of his hat, and something in his stern expression eased just slightly at the corners of his mouth. "Ranch is closer than town," he said. "Bridge is the only crossing for 6 miles either way, and it's gone now. You'll not get back to your boarding house tonight unless you mean to swim." He paused. "I've got a room in the barn loft, clean, dry, door that locks from the inside." You're welcome to it till we sort out the bridge. That's a generous offer from a man I met 5 minutes ago by falling on him." "Wasn't an offer with strings on it," he said, a little sharply, as if she'd accused him of something. "I've got rules for anybody who stays under my roof, Miss Underwood, same as I'd give a hired hand. You'll hear them plain enough once we're dry. But there's no string on this one. You'd be dead in that creek if I hadn't been mending a wheel rim 20 feet off, and I'll be damned if I leave you standing in the rain arguing about propriety." She almost smiled, despite the cold water soaking her boots and the ache starting to bloom behind her eyes. "Then I accept, Mr. Weston. Lead the way." He did, walking the skittish horse with one hand, and after a moment's visible hesitation, offering her his other arm over the rough ground with the other. She took it. It felt, absurdly, like the most natural thing in the world. The Weston ranch sat on a shelf of land above the creek, tucked against a stand of aspen already going gold and brittle with the turn of the season, the forge smoke rising blue-gray from a low stone chimney beside the barn. It was smaller than she'd expected a modest house, a good barn, corrals for perhaps a dozen horses, and the smithy itself, a long open-sided shed with the anvil gleaming dull orange in the last of the coals. Everything about it was neat in a way that spoke of a man who could not abide waste or disorder, tools hung on pegs by size, harness oiled and coiled, firewood stacked with the precision of a mason laying brick. "You keep a tidy place," she said as he led her toward the house. "Tidy places don't kill people," he said. "Loose harness, unbanked coals, a gate left open in a snowstorm. That's how folks die out here, Miss Underwood, same as falling bridges." I don't care much for accidents I could have prevented. There was something under those words, something old and worn smooth by grief, though she did not yet know its shape. She only nodded and let him show her inside and did not ask, not that first evening. There would be time enough for asking. She had already decided, watching him check the horse's legs for strain before he so much as took off his own wet coat, that Orville Weston was a man worth the patience it would take to learn. The house was small but well kept, a single main room with a good stove, a table scarred by years of use, shelves of tools and a few books that surprised her Blackstone's commentaries, a worn Bible, a slim volume of Tennyson that looked read more than the other two combined. He gave her the good chair by the stove and a blanket from a cedar chest, and set water to heat without being asked, moving through his own kitchen with the same unhurried competence he'd shown on the bridge. "Now," he said, when she was dry enough to stop shivering and he had looked briefly and without apology at the cut on her temple and pronounced it shallow, "about those rules. I'm listening. No fires left unattended in the house or the barn, not even banked ones. No strangers pass the gate after dark without my knowing it first. Stock gets checked before full dark and again before sunup, every day, no exceptions for weather. And nobody who sleeps under this roof or in that loft leaves the property without telling me where they're going and when they mean to be back." His jaw was tight when he said the last one, tighter than the rest had warranted. "I don't care if it's to fetch water from the creek. You tell me first. That's a great many rules for one barn loft, Mr. Weston." "They've kept people alive," he said, and something closed over his face like a door shutting, and she understood, without yet knowing the particulars, that this was a wound and not merely a habit. She did not press. She only said, "Then I'll follow them so long as I'm your guest," and watched some of the tension leave his shoulders, as if he had expected an argument and found none. She did not tell him, that first night, that she had spent her whole life being told rules existed to keep her safe by men who meant, in the end, to keep her small. She only filed the thought away, the way she filed away a word in a language not her own, to be understood later in context when she had more of the sentence. The next morning brought Marshal Ezra Pratt riding out to the ranch with news that the bridge was a total loss and no lumber to spare for rebuilding it before the snows, not with every board in the county going to shore up the Bramwell Mining Company's new stamp mill. He brought other news too, delivered with the particular grimness of a lawman 6 days from an election he did not know how to keep honest. "Election's the 23rd, he said, accepting coffee at Orville's table with the air of a man grateful for it. "County commissioner and sheriff both on the ballot, and Silas Bramwell's got his own man running for commissioner, fellow named Mortimer Cole, works the assay office, owes Bramwell money and worse. If Cole wins, first thing on his docket is opening the North Bench for claims, the same ground the Utes have wintered on since before any of us came up this gulch with a pickaxe." "That's treaty land," Winifred said, sharper than she meant to. "Treaty land the government's none too particular about defending, Miss Underwood, as I expect you know better than most." Pratt turned his hat brim in his hands. "Bramwell's been putting out word that the Utes mean trouble this winter on account of what happened up at White River last month. Folks are scared. Scared people vote for the man who promises to make the scary thing go away, treaty or no treaty." Orville's face had gone hard and still in the way she was already learning meant he was holding something back. "Bramwell doesn't care 2 cents about safety," he said. "He cares about the silver vein his own surveyors found running under Ute winter ground, and he means to have it before spring thaw, one way or another." "You've said that to me before, Weston, and I still can't prove it," Pratt said, not unkindly. "You keep your rules and your fences and you're quiet, and folks in town remember Jed Hollies, and that's a harder thing for a man to argue against than a mining claim." Winifred looked between them, cataloging, the way she cataloged everything, the shape of an old story she had not yet been told in full. "Who was Jed Hollies?" she asked. Neither man answered right away. It was Orville who finally spoke, staring into his coffee. "Man who attacked a family on the Silverton Road 3 years back. I was riding through, heard the woman screaming, and I stopped him the only way there was time to stop him." He looked up, and his eyes were very steady, as if daring her to flinch. "I didn't ask for a jury's opinion before I did it. Some folks have never forgiven me for that." "Did the family live?" Winifred asked. "They did." "Then I don't see what there is to forgive," she said, and meant it, and watched something in his face loosen that she suspected had been clenched for 3 long years. Pratt cleared his throat, plainly uncomfortable with sentiment. "Regardless," he said, "I'd take it as a kindness, Miss Underwood, if you'd ride up to the Ute camp before the election and get a plain accounting of what they intend, so I've got something true to set against Bramwell's rumors. Chief Toab's band is camped up past the Two Forks meadow same as every year. They know you. They trust you near as an outsider can be trusted." "I'll go tomorrow," she said, and did not look at Orville when she said it, though she felt him look at her. That night, over a supper of venison stew that he cooked with the same unhurried care he brought to shoeing a horse, Orville asked her how she had come to speak Ute at all, and she told him about her father, a trader who'd worked the Uncompahgre country for a decade before he died, who had raised her half among his own kind and half among the bands he traded with, until she could not always say for certain which language she thought in. "He believed a man who couldn't understand his neighbor was doomed to fear him," she said. "I believed it too once I saw how much trouble came from folks talking past each other instead of to each other. That's why I do this work. Every misunderstanding out here has a cost, Mr. Weston, and most of the time it's paid in blood that didn't have to spill." "You could do easier work," he said, "safer work." "I could," she agreed. "I could also have stayed east and married a banker and never seen a mountain in my life. I didn't want easy, I wanted useful." She glanced up at him, firelight catching the ice-pale color of his eyes. "I expect you understand that better than most men I've met." He didn't answer, but he refilled her coffee without asking, and that, she was learning, was answer enough. The ride to Two Forks Meadow took the better part of a morning, up a trail already crusted with the season's first frost, the aspens shedding gold in slow drifts around them. Orville had insisted on riding with her not, he was careful to say, because he doubted her ability to go alone, but because a lone rider on that trail this week was a foolish thing regardless of who she was, with Bramwell's hired men patrolling the roads on the pretext of protecting claims. Chief Toub received them with the grave courtesy of a man long practiced at being patient with people who had taken more from him than they had ever given back. Winifred greeted him in his own language, and Winifred watched the tension go out of the old man's shoulders at the sound of it, the way it always did, the particular relief of being understood exactly and not approximately. "Tell him," Toub said through her, his son Kanuchi standing near with his arms folded, watching Orville with the wary eye of a young man who had grown up learning which white men could be trusted and had found the number small. "Tell the marshal we have made no plans for war. We have made plans to survive the winter, same as every year, on the ground the treaty promises us. If Bramwell's men come onto that ground before the snow drives us down, it will not be my people who start the trouble." Winifred translated it exactly, without softening or sharpening a single word, because she had learned long ago that the moment a translator began improving what was said for either side's comfort, the translation stopped being useful and started being dangerous. "Tell him I believe him," Orville said. "Tell him I'll say so to anyone who asks, marshal or otherwise." Winifred did. Toub studied Orville for a long moment, and then said something that made Kanuchi's eyebrows lift. "He says," Winifred translated, feeling an odd warmth rise in her own chest at the words, "that he has heard you are a man who does not lie even when a lie would be more comfortable, and that such men are rare enough on any side of any river to be worth remembering." Orville inclined his head to the old man, a gesture of respect Winifred suspected he had learned somewhere in a life she did not yet know the whole of, and said, "Tell him I'll remember his words too." They rode back down the mountain in a silence that felt companionable rather than empty, the light slanting long and amber through the thinning trees, and somewhere in that quiet ride, without either of them naming it, something between them shifted from wary regard into something warmer, something that felt, to Winifred, dangerously like the beginning of trust. The trouble began in earnest 3 days later, when Winifred rode into Ruby Gulch to file her report with the county clerk, and found the boardwalks buzzing with a different rumor entirely. "They're saying Weston threatened Silas Bramwell," said Delia Ann Foss, who ran the mercantile and knew everything in town roughly an hour before anyone else did. "Cornered him outside the assay office yesterday evening, put a hand on him, told him he'd regret pushing the Utes off that north bench. Half the town saw it or says they did." "That doesn't sound like the man I know," Winifred said, and heard in her own voice how certain she already was. "You've known him a week, Miss Underwood." Delia Ann's eyes were not unkind, but they were pitying, the particular pity reserved for women thought to be making a foolish mistake. "Folks around here have known him 3 years, since Jed Holly's, and they've been waiting for him to show his true color ever since. I'd be careful, boarding out at that ranch of his." Winifred did not argue in the mercantile. She saved the argument for Orville, riding back to the ranch at a pace that had her horse blowing hard by the time she reached the gate, and found him at the forge, hammering a wagon axle into shape with blows so controlled and so furious that she understood at once he had already heard. "Did you threaten Bramwell?" she asked, without preamble, over the ring of hammer on iron. He set the hammer down. "I told him," he said, "that if his men so much as rode across the meadow line before the Utes came down for winter, I'd see every claim he holds tied up in a land dispute so long he'd be an old man before he saw $1 of silver from it. I didn't touch him. I didn't need to. Bramwell's the sort of man who mistakes a plain warning for a threat because he's never once in his life heard the truth spoken to him without money changing hands first. That's not what half the town believes." "I know what half the town believes." His voice was rough, and under the roughness she heard something almost like weariness, the particular fatigue of a man long resigned to being disbelieved. "It's what they've believed about me since Holly's. Doesn't much matter what I do now. A man gets a reputation out here the way a river cuts a canyon, Miss Underwood, slow and then all at once, and after that the water only knows the one channel to run in." "I don't believe it," she said. "I was there. You caught me. You gentled that horse like it was your own child. I've watched you all week and none of it squares with what they're saying in town." "Then you're the first person in 3 years to say so plain," he said, and something in his face when he said it undid her a little. Some old loneliness she recognized because she carried a smaller version of it herself, the particular ache of being useful to everyone and truly known by almost no one. "Then I'll say it louder," she said. "I'll go back into town, and I'll tell Delia Ann Foss and anyone else who will stand still long enough to listen exactly what I saw on that bridge, and exactly what I heard at Two Forks Meadow. And if Silas Bramwell wants to call me a liar, he can say so to my face." He looked at her for a long moment, the forge fire painting the planes of his face orange and gold, and said, "Quiet. You don't have to do that. It's not your fight." "It became my fight the day you caught me falling off a bridge, Mr. Weston. I don't leave debts unpaid." She went back into town the next morning and did exactly as she had promised, and if it did not silence the rumor entirely, it slowed it, planted enough doubt that Marshal Pratt felt bold enough to say publicly that he'd found no witness who could swear to seeing an actual assault, only a raised voice and an angry word, and that raised voices were not, last he checked, against county law. Bramwell's smile, when she passed him on the boardwalk that afternoon, was thin and cold and entirely unsurprised, as though her defense of Orville had been exactly what he expected and had already, somehow, accounted for. She thought little of that smile until 4 days later, when she found the first piece of the real evidence, and understood that the rumor about Orville had never been about Orville at all. It had been about her, about discrediting the man sheltering the one woman in Ruby Gulch, capable of proving what Silas Bramwell was truly planning. It happened almost by accident. She had gone to the assay office to file a translated deposition from Chief Toab regarding the meadow boundary, and while she waited for the clerk, she overheard 2 of Bramwell's hired teamsters talking low in Spanish by the loading dock, certain no one nearby could understand them. "El jefe dice que la calle está escondida," one of them said. "The boss says the box is already hidden. En la bodega vieja, detrás de los barrels de pólvora. In the old storehouse, behind the powder barrels. Y si alguien la encuentra antes de la elección, and if someone finds it before the election, no la encontrarán, nadie mira allí, no one will find it, nobody looks there." Winifred did not so much as turn her head, did not let her expression change, filed the words away with the same discipline she brought to every translation, and left the assay office 5 minutes later with her heart hammering so hard she thought it must be audible. A hidden box. Hidden before an election that had not yet happened, which meant it could only be one thing: ballots. Real ballots meant to be swapped out, or fraudulent ones meant to be swapped in, on election night, when confusion and darkness would make the switch invisible to anyone not already looking for it. She rode back to the ranch faster than was strictly safe, and found Orville just finishing at the forge and told him everything, word for word, the way she had trained herself to tell things. He listened without interrupting, his face going graver with every sentence, and when she finished he said, "That storehouse belongs to Bramwell's mine. Old Powder magazine sits behind the stamp mill. If there's a ballot box hidden in there, it's not going anywhere until election night, when he means to swap it for the real count. We have to tell Pratt. Pratt can't search private property on the word of an overheard conversation, not against a man like Bramwell, not without a warrant no judge in this county will sign in time." Orville's jaw worked. "We need proof he can act on, and we've got 5 days to find it." It was that same night, with the wind picking up out of the northwest in a way that promised the season's first real snow, that Canucci came riding down out of the dark to the ranch gate, his horse blown and sweating, with news that changed the shape of everything. Winifred met him at the fence before Orville even had his boots on, translating in the dark and the cold, her breath fogging between every rushed sentence. "He says," she told Orville, who had come out half-dressed with a rifle in hand at the sound of hooves. "He says Bramwell's men have been seen moving through the timber above the meadow tonight, dressed and painted to look like Ute raiders, carrying torches. He says his father believes they mean to burn an empty cabin near the mill tonight and blame it on the band, so that by morning the whole town believes the Utes have already started the very war Bramwell's been warning them about. He says if that happens before the election, no jury of white men in this county will care what really happened. They'll only care that they were afraid, and Bramwell's man Cole will win by acclamation." "Then we stop it before morning," Orville said. "He says his father is already moving the camp back from the meadow line out of caution, but someone needs to warn the town, and someone needs to be a witness who isn't Ute, because a Ute witness won't be believed no matter how true the account, not by the men who will be voting in 5 days." Winifred's voice had gone tight with fury at the injustice of that plain fact, an injustice she had spent her whole working life pressing against without ever quite breaking it. "I have to go with him, Orville. I have to see it myself, so I can say so, in English, to a room full of men who will only trust their own kind to tell them the truth. Not alone. Not tonight, not with that storm coming and Bramwell's men armed and playing at war paint in the dark." His voice had gone hard, and beneath the hardness she heard fear, real fear, old fear, and understood with sudden and total clarity exactly what rule she was about to break. "You have rules," she said, gentler now. "I know you do, I know why. But there isn't time to wake you properly and argue this through to your satisfaction, and if I wait until morning there won't be anything left to witness but ash and a story already hardened into truth. I have to go now, while there's still time to change what happens. Winifred." "I'm leaving a note," she said, already turning for the house, already pulling her coat from its peg. "I'm telling you exactly where I'm going and why, same as your rule says, only I can't wait for your permission because permission takes time we don't have. I'm not leaving because I don't respect your rules, Orville. I'm leaving because I respect what's right more." She wrote it fast by lamplight, her hand only a little unsteady, "Gone with Canucci to witness what Bramwell's men do tonight above the meadow. Back before dawn if I can manage it. Forgive me the rule. I could not forgive myself the alternative. W." She left it on the table where he would find it the moment he came back inside, and then she was up on Canucci's spare horse and gone into the dark and the rising wind before Orville had finished pulling on his boots, and by the time he came out onto the porch, rifle in hand, lamp already guttering behind him, there was nothing left of her but hoofbeats fading up the black trail toward Two Forks Meadow, and the small square of paper on his kitchen table. And a fear in his chest so old and so total it took him back 3 years in a single breath, to another woman, another night, another set of hoofbeats that had ridden away from him and never come home. He was in the saddle inside of 2 minutes. The ride up to the meadow was the longest of his life, longer even than the ride he had taken 3 years ago chasing his sister Clara's wagon into a blizzard that had already, though he had not known it yet, taken her from him for good. He had made his rule about leaving the very week he buried her, in ground so frozen they'd had to build a fire over the plot for 2 days before the shovels could break it. And he had never once, in the 3 years since, imagined a circumstance under which he would forgive anyone for riding off alone into danger without his knowing. He forgave Winifred Underwood somewhere on that trail, in the dark, snow beginning to sift down through the black branches overhead, before he had even found her again. He forgave her because he understood, with a clarity that frightened him more than the storm did, that she had not left carelessly. She had left the way he himself would have left, if the choice had been between a rule and a rightness, and he could not in honesty fault her for choosing exactly as he would have chosen. He found her and Canucci crouched in the timber above the meadow's western edge, close enough to see the flicker of torchlight moving through the trees near the old empty cabin that had once belonged to a trapper, close enough to hear men's voices pitched low and laughing under crude paint and borrowed blankets meant to pass, at a distance and in darkness, for something they were not. "There," Winifred whispered when he dropped silently beside her and did not ask why he had come, only reached back and gripped his hand once, hard in the dark, a wordless thank you that undid something tight in his chest. "6 of them. I count 6. They mean to fire the cabin and ride hard back toward town before anyone's close enough to see their faces clear. Then we make sure someone sees their faces clear," Orville said. It was Canucci in the end who moved first, slipping through the trees on foot with the silence of a man who had hunted this ground since he was a boy, close enough to see, in the flare of a struck match, the pale skin at one rider's wrist where his borrowed blanket had slipped, and close enough, when the torch went to the cabin's dry roof and the flames leapt up gold and furious against the black sky, to recognize the voice that laughed and called out, "That'll put the fear of God in them by morning." As belonging to Silas Bramwell's own foreman, a man named Gantry, known through the whole gulch by his broken nose and his gap-toothed grin. They did not try to stop the fire. There was no water near enough, and 6 armed men against 3 watchers would have ended in blood rather than justice. They watched instead, memorizing, counting, and Winifred, lying flat in the frost beside Orville with her heart hammering against the cold ground, understood that this quiet, dangerous witnessing was its own kind of courage, no less real for being bloodless. They rode back down toward town before the false raiders did, taking the steeper, faster deer trail that Canucci knew and the horses barely tolerated. And it was there, on that narrow shelf of trail above the stamp mill, with the eastern sky just beginning to gray toward dawn, that the second danger of that long night found them. The mill's ore tramway ran on a cable track down the mountainside above the town, carrying loaded carts of crushed rock down to the wagons that hauled it to the smelter, and someone, perhaps in the chaos of the false raid, perhaps deliberately, to add one more terror to the tally that would greet Ruby Gulch by morning, had released the brake on a fully loaded cart at the top of the run. They heard it before they saw it. A low grinding shriek of iron on iron, gathering speed, and then the cart itself burst into view around the bend below them, careening down the steep track with a howling momentum that would carry it, in less than 2 minutes, straight through the lower yard of the stamp mill where the night shift's bunkhouse stood, and past it, toward the cluster of tents and wagons where half the town's men had gathered to sleep before an early vote count straight, Orville realized with a cold lurch in his stomach. Toward the very meadow's edge where dozens of sleeping families had pitched camp for the coming election, unwilling to risk the mountain roads twice in one. "Weak, the brake levers snapped," he said, already wheeling his horse toward the tramway's lower trestle, where the track crossed a ravine on a wooden bridge not unlike the one that had nearly killed Winifred a fortnight before. "If that cart hits the trestle at that speed loaded, it'll take the whole bridge down onto the camp below. What can you do?" Winifred was already turning her own horse to follow him, refusing, even now, even exhausted and half frozen, to be left behind. "There's a spur line, a dead siding, cut into the hillside about 40 yards above the trestle, built for maintenance carts. If I can throw the switch before that cart passes it, it'll run itself out into the siding instead of onto the bridge." He was already dismounting at a dead run toward a small iron shed beside the track where he kept, he explained in short breathless bursts, a set of tools for exactly this kind of trouble, because he was the only smith within 20 miles who serviced the tramway's cable and brake fittings, and he had warned Bramwell's foreman a dozen times that the old brake lever wanted replacing before it failed. "The switch throw is stiff, wants 2 hands and a bar. I can do it if I've got someone to warn the camp below in case I'm too slow." "Go," Winifred said. "I'll warn them." She did not wait to see if he approved. She was already off her horse and running, her skirts gathered in one fist, shouting in English, and then, when she reached the edge of the tent camp and saw Canucci's father's people among the frightened faces stumbling up out of their bedrolls, shouting the same warning in Ute, her voice carrying clear and commanding across the gray dawn light, "The cart is loose. Get back from the bridge, get up the slope now." The camp scattered like startled quail, mothers snatching children, men grabbing what they could carry. The whole sleepy chaos of it moving up and away from the ravine in the space of perhaps 90 seconds, which was very nearly not enough time. Because above them, on the tramway, Orville Weston had reached the switch and found it exactly as stiff and stubborn as he'd feared. Rusted half shut by 3 years of neglect Bramwell's foreman had never bothered to correct. He heard the cart coming before he had the bar seated properly in the switch mechanism, heard the shriek of it growing, felt the whole trestle beginning to hum under his boots with the vibration of 2 tons of ore rushing toward it at a speed no brake now controlled. He set his full weight against the bar, every muscle in his back and shoulders screaming, and thought, with a strange calm that surprised him even as it saved him, of Clara, of the promise he had made over her grave that he would never again let carelessness cost a life he might have saved with his own 2 hands. The switch gave with a grinding shudder half a second before the cart reached it, iron rails swinging just enough, and the loaded cart screamed off the main track and onto the dead siding, hurtling 40 more feet before it buried its front wheels in the packed earth berm at the siding's end and rocked, shuddering, to a violent, grinding stop, ore spilling in a gray avalanche across the hillside but harming no one, touching nothing but rock and dirt and the pale coming light of dawn. Silence fell over the ravine, broken only by the settling clatter of loose ore and from below, the ragged sound of people realizing all at once that they were alive. Winifred found him still standing at the switch, both hands locked white-knuckled around the bar, breathing as though he had run every mile of that trestle himself, and she did not say a word. She simply crossed the last few yards between them and put her arms around him, and felt him shake once hard, the way a man shakes when the fear catches up to him only after the danger has already passed. "You did it," she said, into his shoulder. "You saved every soul in that camp." "We did," he said, and his voice was rough and unsteady in a way she had not heard from him before, not even on the bridge. "You warned them in time, if you hadn't." "I told you I'd learn your rules," she said, drawing back just far enough to look at him, "and I meant to keep everyone I could. But I could not have kept the rule about leaving tonight, Orville, not and lived with myself after. I hope you can forgive that." He looked down at her for a long moment, dawnlight turning the frost in her loosened hair to 1,000 small fires, and something in his chest that had been clenched shut for 3 years finally, fully, let go. "There's nothing to forgive," he said. "I made that rule the week I buried my sister. She left the ranch alone against my wishes, rode out in a storm to fetch a doctor for a hired hand who turned out not to need one, and her wagon went off the road 2 miles from home. I found her 3 days later, past helping." His voice caught, and he let it, for the first time in 3 years letting someone see the whole shape of that old grief instead of the hard shell he had grown over it. "I told myself if I made enough rules, kept close enough watch, I'd never bury anyone else I loved that way. I didn't know, until tonight, that a rule like that doesn't keep people safe so much as it keeps them small. You rode into danger tonight, and you rode out again having saved a whole camp of sleeping families. I'm not sorry you broke my rule, Winifred. I'm only sorry I made a rule in the first place that asked you to be less than exactly what you are." She reached up slow and touched the side of his face, where soot and frost had mingled on 3 days' growth of beard, and he turned into her hand the way a man turns toward warmth after a long cold season. "Then don't reinstate it," she said, very softly. "I won't," he said, "not that one, not ever again." And then, because the dawn was breaking gold over the ravine and the danger was past, and there was nothing left in the world just then but the 2 of them standing amid spilled ore on a silent trestle, he kissed her carefully at first, as though asking permission even now, and then, when she answered him without hesitation, not carefully at all, both of them holding on as though the ground itself might still give way beneath them, and finding instead that for the first time in a long while it held. They did not have long to savor it. Below them, the camp was rousing fully now, voices rising in confusion and relief, and among them, unmistakable even at this distance. The furious shout of Silas Bramwell demanding to know who in the hell had thrown that switch, and why his foreman gantry could not be found anywhere in camp. Winifred and Orville rode down together to meet the gathering crowd, and it was there, in the gray light of that long, dangerous night finally ending, that Marshal Ezra Pratt arrived at a gallop with news that changed everything again. "Gantry's been found," Pratt called out, swinging down from his horse with a grimness that silenced the murmuring crowd. "Found him hiding in the old powder magazine behind the stamp mill, still half in that painted getup, trying to bury a box under a false floor. A ballot box, Weston. County seal still on it, unopened, meant to be swapped in tonight after they'd burned that cabin and scared half the town half to death. He's talking plenty now that he's caught, trying to lay the whole scheme at Bramwell's feet to save his own neck from a rope." The crowd's murmur turned, in the space of a breath, from confusion to fury, and Silas Bramwell, standing pale and suddenly very alone at its edge, seemed to understand, watching the faces turn toward him, that the reputation he had spent months building against a Ute band, and a blacksmith he'd never managed to properly discredit, had just collapsed as thoroughly and as suddenly as the bridge Winifred Underwood had fallen through 2 weeks before. "This woman," Bramwell said, pointing at Winifred with a hand that trembled with fury, "has been consorting with savages and stirring." "This woman," Marshal Pratt cut in, with a flatness that carried more authority than shouting ever could, "just saved every family in that camp from a runaway ore cart, same as Weston did. And she's the only soul in this gulch who can stand up tomorrow and tell a room full of voters, in plain English, exactly what she watched your foreman do tonight in the timber above the meadow, dressed up to look like the very war you've been telling this whole county to fear. I'd mind my next word real careful, Mr. Bramwell, if I were you." Bramwell did not have a next word. He turned and walked away through the murmuring crowd, and by that afternoon, word had spread through every tent and cabin in Ruby Gulch that the ballot box theft, the false raid, and the fire were all laid at his door, corroborated by his own foreman's confession, and by the sworn account of a translator and a blacksmith who had watched it happen with their own eyes. The 5 days remaining before the election passed in a blur of depositions and hearings before Judge Alden Marsh, who had ridden up from the county seat to sort out the mess before ballots could be legally cast, and through all of it, Winifred Underwood stood in that makeshift courtroom, a tent borrowed from the mining company itself, in one of the small ironies the town would talk about for years, and translated Chief Toab's own account of the night, word for exact word, into English for a jury of miners and shopkeepers who had never before troubled themselves to hear a Ute man's testimony, given the full weight of truth rather than rumor. "He asks," Winifred said, her voice steady and clear in that crowded tent, "that this court remember his people did not start the fear that has gripped this town this season. He asks that, when the ballots are counted, the men of Ruby Gulch remember who told them lies, and who told them the truth, even when the truth was harder to hear than the lie." There was a long silence after she finished speaking, and then, from the back of the crowded tent, Delia Ann Foss stood up and said, loud enough for the whole tent to hear, "I reckon I owe you an apology, Miss Underwood and Mr. Weston too. I was wrong about the both of you, and I aim to say so to anyone who'll listen, same as I said the other. It was not the whole town, not all at once, but it was a beginning," and Winifred understood, watching that stern little shopkeeper sit back down with her chin held high, that a reputation built on rumor could be unbuilt the same slow way it had been made, one honest word at a time. Silas Bramwell was arrested 2 days before the election on charges of election fraud and arson, his foreman Gantry turning fuller witness with every hour that passed in the county jail, and Mortimer Cole, seeing which way the wind now blew, quietly withdrew his own candidacy rather than face the vote at all. The county commissioner's seat went, in the end, to a mild-mannered freight agent named Hosea Dunlap, who had wanted nothing more from the whole business than to see the roads kept clear, and the treaty line respected. And Marshal Ezra Pratt won his own seat back by the largest margin any sheriff's race had seen in that county's short history. On election night itself, with the first real snow of the season finally falling soft and silent over Ruby Gulch, Chief Toab and a small delegation from his band came down to the edge of town, at Winifred's invitation and with Marshal Pratt's blessing, to stand witness as the true ballots were counted by lamplight in the tent that had so recently served as a courtroom. It was, Winifred thought, watching the old man's face in the lamp glow as the count was read aloud and confirmed honest, the closest thing to justice this hard little silver town had ever managed to produce, and it had taken a broken bridge, a runaway ore cart, and a woman's stubborn insistence on telling the exact truth to get there. Orville stood beside her through the whole of it, not saying much, the way he rarely said much, but his hand found hers in the crowd more than once, and each time she found herself leaning just slightly into his shoulder, the way a woman leans into a wall she has learned, finally, to trust will not give way. They rode back to the ranch together that night through softly falling snow, the town behind them lit gold with lamps and bonfires, as Ruby Gulch celebrated an honest count for the first time in longer than anyone could quite remember. And Orville reined in his horse at the top of the ridge where the whole valley spread out below them, town lights small and warm against the dark mountains, and turned to look at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, not the wariness of their first meeting, not even the fierce protectiveness of the night on the trestle, but something quieter and steadier, and altogether more frightening to a man who had spent 3 years building walls. Specifically so he would never again have to feel it. "I want to tell you something," he said, "and I want you to hear the whole of it before you answer, because I've thought about how to say it since that morning on the trestle, and I still don't know that I've found the right words." "I'm listening," she said, echoing deliberately the words she'd said to him on the bridge, and saw him almost smile at the memory. "I built my whole life around rules because I thought rules could keep me from ever losing anyone the way I lost Clara," he said. "I thought if I just kept close enough watch, kept the gate locked and the fire banked and everyone accounted for before dark, I'd never have to feel that particular kind of empty again. And then you rode off into a storm against every rule I had, and instead of losing you, I found out what it feels like to trust somebody enough to let them go and have faith they'll come back to you anyway. That's a harder thing to learn than any rule I ever made, and I don't want to unlearn it. I don't ever want to go back to being a man who mistakes control for love. Orville." "Let me finish," he said gently, and she quieted, watching snow catch in his dark hair, watching his breath fog pale in the cold air between them. "I'm not going to ask you to marry me tonight, standing on a ridge in the snow like some fool in a dime novel. You deserve better courting than that, and I mean to give it to you, slow and proper, however long it takes. But I want you to know, right now, plain as I can say it, that there's no rule left in me about you leaving. Not one. You go where your work takes you, up to Toab's camp, down to the county seat, wherever the truth needs telling, and you'll never once come home to find me angry that you went without my say-so. I trust you with your own life the same as I trust you with mine. That's not a rule, Winifred. That's a promise, and I mean to keep it a good deal longer than 3 years." She sat her horse in the falling snow and looked at this man who had once been the most feared soul in the whole gulch and was, she now knew with absolute certainty, the safest place she had ever stood, and felt something in her chest settle the way a key settles into a lock built exactly for its shape. "I've spent my whole life being useful to people who never quite saw me," she said. "My father loved me, but he needed my tongue more than he needed my company. The town needs my work, but half of them still look at me sideways for the company I keep. You're the first person who's ever looked at me and seen the whole of what I am, and not been afraid of any part of it." She reached across the small space between their horses and took his hand, bare and cold and steady in the snow. "I don't want easy courting, Orville Weston. I want honest courting." Come find me tomorrow and the day after that, and every day the weather allows it, and ask me again properly. And I expect my answer's going to be the same every single time you ask. Is that a yes to the courting, or a yes to something further along than that?" "That," she said, leaning across to kiss him softly, unhurried, snow settling on both their shoulders like a blessing neither of them had thought to ask for, "is a yes to whatever you're brave enough to ask me, for as long as we both live in this gulch or any other." They rode down to the ranch in a silence that held no loneliness in it at all, and that winter, as the passes closed behind the season's first true storm and Ruby Gulch settled into the long, quiet months of snow and forge fire and candle-lit evenings, Orville Weston courted Winifred Underwood exactly as he had promised, slow and honest, and without a single rule between them that either one had not chosen freely for themselves. He asked her properly in the spring, when the passes opened again, and the aspens along Silver Creek put out their first pale green, on the rebuilt bridge itself, standing on new timber he had cut and set with his own hands through the long winter, because he said he could not think of a more fitting place to ask a woman to stay with him forever than the exact spot where he had first caught her falling and never once, in all the months since, let her go. She said yes before he had even finished the question, and he laughed, real and unguarded, the sound of it carrying warm across the water below, and picked her up off her feet right there on the new bridge and spun her once, careless of dignity, careless of the wagon driver who passed them on the road and tipped his hat with a knowing grin. They did not marry with any great fuss. No church large enough stood in Ruby Gulch that year, and neither of them wanted the show of it regardless. They stood instead one evening at the ranch, under the wide Colorado sky just beginning to prick with stars, Chief Toab and Canucci among the small gathering of friends who had come to witness it, Marshal Pratt standing as the nearest thing to official presence the moment required, and they spoke their vows to each other plainly, the way they had learned to speak everything else between them, without rules, without pretense, and without a single word left untranslated between two hearts that had, from the very first catch on a falling bridge, understood each other completely. "I promise you my whole truth always," Winifred said, translated for no one's comfort but yours, and never softened to spare either of us the hard parts. "I promise you my whole trust," Orville answered, "and not one rule between us that keeps you smaller than exactly what you are. Wherever you need to go, I'll either be riding beside you or waiting with the gate open when you come home, and I will never again mistake fear for love." The forge fire burned warm behind them in the gathering dark. The mountains stood black and eternal against a sky flung wide with stars, and somewhere up past Two Forks Meadow, where a treaty line now stood honestly respected, and a false war had never been allowed to catch, the last of that hard, dangerous autumn's troubles lay finally and fully behind them, leaving nothing ahead but the long good years of a life two capable people had chosen freely to build together. Ruby Gulch, in the years that followed, would tell the story of that election season many times over, of a bridge that broke and a hand that caught, of a false raid unmasked, and a runaway cart stopped before it could reach the sleeping camp below, of a blacksmith once feared for a killing that had in truth only ever proven his heart, and a translator whose stubborn insistence on exact truth had, in the end, saved more lives than any rule ever could. But Winifred and Orville themselves told it more simply, on the rare evenings friends asked to hear it straight from the two who had lived it, sitting together by their own hearth with the forge banked low outside, and the whole wide valley quiet under snow or starlight depending on the season. "He had rules about everything once," Winifred would say, "and I broke the one about leaving. And I never once wanted it back," Orville would finish, taking her hand the way he had that first snowy night on the ridge, "because the woman who broke it was worth every rule I ever had to unlearn."